Welcome back to the Program Design Series. Last time we discussed reps and intensity. Today we're going to get into the details of volume, how to determine what's best for an athlete, how to actually calculate it, and how to distribute it through a mesocycle. When it comes to volume, we can get very mathematical and calculate it precisely, and I'll show you how to do that. But I'm also going to explain that no matter how precise your calculations are, you're still relying on your judgment to some extent. The figures will never actually be a completely precise representation of the training burden. Volume is the total number of reps performed in the time period we're looking at, anything from a single set to a full training session to an entire mesocycle. Simple enough, but it gets more complicated because we have to decide exactly which reps to count. The main concept to keep in mind when making decisions about volume calculations is that the whole purpose is to create an accurate measurement of the training burden on the athlete so that we can control it the way we need to produce the best adaptations. Generally, we don't count light sets like warm-ups because they don't have enough of an impact to require consideration, and aside from being extra work, it dilutes the picture to some degree. The convention is to only begin counting volume at over 60%, and some coaches will only begin at 70%. Which you do is largely personal preference, but you need to be consistent at least with a specific athlete in order for your volume numbers to be useful long-term. You need to be able to compare different phases and training cycles to evaluate them effectively, and if your volume number includes 60% plus sometimes and 70% plus other times, your accuracy is way off before you even start. Then we have a problem with certain supplemental exercises that are conventionally prescribed as a percent of a primary lift. For example, intensity for RDLs is often prescribed as a percent of the athlete's best back squat, meaning we're likely in the 40 to 60% range most of the time. Good mornings are similar and will be an even lower percentage. So do we not count RDLs or good mornings in our volume calculations? This is our first real test of judgment. We have to decide whether or not to consider these kinds of exercises even though their intensity prescriptions fall below our normal threshold for inclusion. In this case, both are definitely impactful exercises, so not counting them toward volume would be a bad idea. Technique exercises are the next most common complication. By nature, they're often going to be under 60%. But if we have a training session with 3 exercises like this and a total of 45 reps, does that training just not exist because it's under 60%? Do we treat this like sub 60% warm-ups or differently because it comprises more volume? Or because it has a significant mental element that's going to increase its physiological impact beyond what the physical intensity would suggest? There's no definite answer, unfortunately. You're left to decide how to manage these situations in a way that provides you useful data for program design. Like the threshold for starting to count volume, how you handle these things is really up to you, but it needs to be consistent at least for each athlete so you can actually put that information to use in future programs. Regardless of what exactly you're including, those figures are still valuable even within a program to control trends within the microcycle, mesocycle, and macrocycle because you'll be using a consistent method within that training program, so numbers will make sense relative to each other. For example, you'll be able to increase or decrease volume as much as you want from one week to the next, or distribute the total mesocycle volume in the pattern you want. Finally, it's important when you're looking at recommended volume figures from other sources to know what they're counting. If you read that an intermediate athlete should average 250 reps a week, if you don't know if that's starting to count at 60 or 70%, and if it includes lighter technique work, you could easily be off by 20% or more. The next question is how to count complexes, and to me this is simple. Anything you would count as a standalone exercise, you should count as part of a complex. If you do a complex of snatch pull plus overhead squat, counting that as one rep because you only do the complex one time per set makes no sense at all. That's 3 distinct exercises that all have meaningful impact, and if you did them separately, you'd obviously count them. If you're thinking that you can just be consistent and count all complexes as one rep because you're just comparing these things within a cycle for a given athlete, kind of like how you can choose at what intensity to start counting volume, that doesn't work in this case, even if you could somehow convince yourself that 3 equals 1. If you have multiple complexes that have different numbers of exercises and reps, counting all complexes as one rep doesn't even get you sensible numbers for comparison within a cycle, let alone between multiple cycles. A set of power clean plus front squat plus power jerk plus clean plus jerk is in no way an equivalent amount of work to a snatch pull plus overhead squat. And also consider the progression of a macro cycle. If you're using complexes, their volume is likely to drop with progressive mesocycles, and in later cycle phases, you're not likely to be using them at all. For example, maybe that clean and jerk complex changes to clean plus front squat plus jerk, meaning it's now only 3 reps instead of 5, which is a 40% reduction. If you just count each complex as 1 rep, these very significant changes are not being represented, which is going to lead to micro and mesocycle volumes that don't have the intended and needed effect. This approach to counting volume in complexes applies equally to the clean and jerk. A clean and jerk single is really 2 reps, 1 clean plus 1 jerk. If you had an athlete performing cleans and jerks separately in a workout, you'd count every rep of each lift. So how does it make sense to eliminate half those reps just because they're done back to back? And finally, how do we deal with accessory exercises? This is probably the most ambiguous of all for a few reasons. First, this is really lightweight work compared to all the barbell training. Even a max effort set of dumbbell curls is nothing even approaching the systemic impactfulness of an easy back squat triple. Second, there's massive variability in this kind of work. Weighted lunges, pull-ups, hanging leg raises, curls, supine banded plank marches, these things aren't really possible to compare directly. But like lightweight technique training that falls below the 60% intensity threshold, it's not like this work doesn't exist or has no effect on the athlete, so we need to take it into consideration somehow. One way is to actually keep 2 volume counts through a cycle, one for the primary training and one for accessory work. This lets you track both accurately but keep them separate so your analysis makes more sense. This also lets you easily change volume week to week in each one to make sure you're actually changing what you need to, rather than thinking you've decreased your microcycle volume by 10%, but 90% of that change was just an easy accessory work, so the effect is not what you're expecting. And this is not even considering things like isometrics. Is a 30-second plank 1 rep or 30 reps? 2 other approaches are to count sets rather than reps, and to count the time it takes rather than the sets or reps at all. Again, what you do is up to you, but it's important to be consistent. A final note on accessory work. Largely what we're doing with volume is controlling the dosages of stimulus and recovery to ensure the athlete is able to perform as needed each training session. Along these lines, keep in mind the local effects of accessory work on the athlete's ability in subsequent training. For example, a bunch of ab work on Tuesday isn't likely to have any meaningful systemic effect on a lifter's ability to perform heavy clean and jerks on Wednesday, but considerable ab fatigue and soreness could limit that performance in a mechanical sense. So it's important to not just look at accessory training volume, but at its timing and how it may affect a training session that follows. Blasting the trunk the day before a heavy squat or clean and jerk workout, or annihilating the triceps and shoulders with beach work the day before heavy jerks are examples of problematic scheduling. It's smart to put this kind of accessory work on the same day as the lifts it would most negatively affect to maximize recovery time before the next iteration and minimize disruption. So the big question is, how much volume is optimal for an athlete? And this isn't a simple answer either, but we'll look at how to figure it out. First, optimal volume is going to depend on all the factors I've discussed in this series related to the athlete and the training circumstances. Second, volume will change as a macrocycle progresses from more to less on average. And third, optimal volume will increase as a new lifter develops, then decrease after they've peaked. In other words, determining optimal volume is essentially a continuous exercise. You don't get to just figure it out once and then leave it forever. When you're trying to determine volume for a lifter, always start low and work up. This ensures your evaluation of the effects is accurate. If you start high and it's too much volume for the lifter, they're still going to be fatigued as you're trying to evaluate their response to a reduced amount week after week. So you'll keep reducing more and more and end up with much less volume than is really suitable for them, because what you're seeing is lingering fatigue from previous excessive volume, not a product of the current volume. As a very loose starting point, here are some volume figures for skill levels ranging from beginner to top national championship level competitor that would be used in a preparatory mesocycle, meaning the highest volume levels of a program. These consider reps at 70% and higher and include some discretionary technique and similar work that doesn't meet that threshold, and the total would be for a traditional 4-week-long mesocycle. This gives us a starting point to assign and distribute volume through a mesocycle. You can find recommendations for dramatically higher numbers, like over double these in certain sources. These figures are based on my experience with typical drug-free, non-professional weightlifters. That said, even with my own athletes at the same levels of competition, I've successfully used numbers much higher than these. So just remember that these are both conservative and very loose starting points. Don't go around telling people I said these are always the exact perfect volume figures. In a mesocycle, volume will generally decrease from start to finish, but not necessarily directly, and change week to week is typically around 10 to 15%. There are exceptions to this. In some cases, you can get away with essentially static volume for 3 weeks or so while increasing intensity, if the intensity starts and builds conservatively enough, and you have a dramatic reduction to deload at the end, something like 50%. This can be appropriate in early prep phases. It's not something you'd want to do in the final weeks leading into a competition. More conventionally, we'll see weekly changes in volume. For example, we may have a mesocycle with this distribution of the total volume: 30%, 27%, 23%, and 20%. If we have a total of 800 reps in the mesocycle, that's 240, 216, 184, and 160 reps. This is a classic progression. The volume decreases from weeks 1 to 4, and the intensity increases weeks 1 through 3, then drops week 4 to deload before the next mesocycle. But we could also order those volumes differently to break up the biggest volume weeks while increasing intensity weeks 1 through 3 in the same way. So we could start with 30%, then drop it to 23% week 2 for a bit of recovery, then back up to 27% week 3, and then again finish with 20% to deload both volume and intensity. In competition prep mesocycles, we're going to have less total volume because the intensity is increasing and reps are lower on average. How much less will largely depend on how much we had in the prep phases. The higher our volume there, the more dramatic the change will typically be, potentially as much as a 25 to 35% reduction. In comp prep mesos, we're more than likely going to keep a normal continual reduction of volume from start to finish, but with a more dramatic reduction week to week, such as 35%, 28%, 22%, and 15%, because we're trying to clear as much fatigue as possible while increasing intensity to its peak for competition. So for our 800 rep prep mesocycle athlete, we may have 600 reps in a competition meso, meaning we'd see 210, 168, 132, and 90 reps. Remember that these figures aren't magical. You can play with the distribution to find what's most effective. This is just to give you a rough idea of the process and the general trends we want to see. And bear in mind again that volume is intimately tied to intensity and therefore indirectly to exercise selection. What's perfect volume in one macro cycle for an athlete may not be in another cycle if intensity and exercise selection are significantly different. Finally, I'd be remiss to not include Prilepin's table in any discussion of training volume, so here we go. If you're not familiar with it, Prilepin's table provides recommended rep and volume figures for intensity ranges based on Soviet research of Olympic weightlifters. While it definitely has utility, it's also pretty broad, so it doesn't eliminate the need for judgment and athlete evaluation. It's not going to guide you directly to the perfect training program. A good way to use it is as verification that what you're planning isn't way off base, kind of like the laugh test. If you write a program and your numbers are outside these ranges, you know you should be thinking about whether or not you're making good choices. There will absolutely be cases when an effective program has prescriptions that fall outside these numbers, but it's not going to be typical, and it's probably going to be only with some of the exercises, not an entire program. Look at a classic prescription of 5x5 squats, let's say at 75%. That's 25 reps, which exceeds the total range for that intensity, but barely, and it's not at all unreasonable. If you change that to 4 sets of 10 at 70%, you'd be well outside both the reps per set and total rep range, so now you really need to ask yourself if it's a wise choice. But you also need to consider this in context. What else is happening in this training cycle alongside this one exercise? What if this athlete isn't doing the competition lifts with any significant volume or intensity because of an injury, so we're really pushing leg strength for a period of time? That's going to mean we can stack up a lot more volume on squats than we could if training everything else equally in a normal cycle. In a situation like that, far exceeding the Prilepin recommendations may not be a problem at all, and actually be a very good choice. Also keep in mind what I discussed in the previous video about the variability in percentages among athletes. You need to consider this when using Prilepin's table, because if an athlete needs to use atypically high percentages at a given rep range, their programs have the potential to regularly violate these recommendations, even when the loading is perfectly appropriate. Along these same lines, I would say that in general, despite its source being Olympic weightlifters, Prilepin's table is better suited for strength lifts than the competition lifts. The technical ability and consistency with the snatch and clean and jerk, and the percentage of the competition lifts of the related basic strength abilities of a lifter are going to vary significantly, affecting how well the table represents the level of burdening these lifts create. 6 doubles in the clean and jerk at 79% fits into the table, But this is a completely different level of demand for an athlete whose clean and jerk is 95% of their best front squat versus 70%. So again, so much of writing effective training programs is being familiar with the athlete and knowing how to adjust conventional programming to best suit them. Next time, who knows? I'll probably get into exercise selection and laying out a microcycle and possibly assigning intensity and volume to those exercises, but I'm just going to go with my heart in the moment. Hope to see you then.